Chances are Evergrande is a new word that just entered your vocabulary, maybe sometime in the last couple of weeks. That is unless you're big into real estate or you used to live in China or something like that. So the question is this China's Lehman moment? And could this be the starting point for a massive recession? Also, what the heck is this company? What are the implications if it fails? And are all of these sensationalized headlines that we're seeing all over the place true? Let's discuss. Evergrande is China's second largest property developer by sales, and their bread and butter is residential apartments. But also they do all kinds of commercial projects, things like theme parks and shopping malls that support the growing middle class in China. So when this story broke, the media immediately drew this connection between Evergrande's insolvency and the collapse of Lehman Brothers, calling it, again, China's Lehman moment. And this is because the Lehman collapse was somewhat synonymous with the start of the 2007-2008 Great Recession. And then what I've seen is, over the past couple of weeks, speculation about how widespread the problem is and will become, has kind of been top of mind for everybody. So for me and for most of my viewers, which I know are in the United States, the question is if and when we'll be impacted by all of this. So to answer this question, we really have to look at Evergrande's business model, the amount and type of debt that they're likely to default on, and also a few other key factors. If you're just here for the short answer and my take without detailed explanation, here it is. Even if Evergrande becomes completely insolvent and implodes in on itself, I don't think the average American's even going to notice. The only exception there would be if you own Evergrande stock or if you own any of the bonds that they've issued, in which case, yeah, you're probably going to take a huge loss. But other than that, probably not. My recommendation, definitely do not YOLO your entire life savings into this company. I have to say this is for entertainment purposes, not financial advice. But, at the end of the day, I don't recommend YOLOing into much except for VTI, which is what I do. So anyways, to better understand the situation, let's compare the Lehman collapse to what's happening right now with Evergrande. So both companies were involved in real estate and both were or are highly leveraged, meaning lots of debt. And that's pretty much where the similarities end. Right now, Evergrande's got about $300 billion in debt, which they're at risk of defaulting on. For context, Lehman Brothers owed over $629 billion, so more than double the amount of debt when they collapsed. But less debt is not why I think that those outside of, mainland China will be relatively unaffected. See, the thing is the amount of debt you have is completely relevant to also the amount of income and assets that you have, right? So, when I was a teenager, if I had $100 in debt, that would have seemed like the end of the world. But today, that's a really manageable sum. So the same is true for both of these companies, right? Just looking at a total debt figure doesn't really tell you much. You got to look at the amount of revenue and EBITDA that Evergrande has, and then the debt service payments and financial leverage ratios. At the end of the day, I'm not going to really get into any of that. The takeaway is obviously, like the media has said, they can't service their debt anymore, or they're at risk of not servicing their debt anymore. But what I do want to focus on is the type of assets, both that Lehman held and that Evergrande currently holds, because there's a significant difference here, and understanding what that is really important to understanding this situation at large. So let's talk first about Lehman. They were holding mostly derivatives, specifically credit default swaps and collateralized debt obligations. If that sounds like a mouthful, it is. What it really means is that Lehman Brothers did not own the actual property. They didn't own the homes or the land, and the company took on extreme levels of debt, betting that folks would continue to make payments, folks in the US would continue to make payments on subprime mortgages. And this was very risky because the assets underlying these derivatives were not financially sound. So when we compare this with Evergrande, they hold primarily land, which is a real physical asset that's not going anywhere. It's not going to zero tomorrow. And this is a much different situation. Again, these derivative instruments, you could wake up tomorrow and they'd be near zero, which is kind of what happened. Whereas Evergrande owns physical property. So I don't see a systemic risk with Evergrande, whereas there was with the U.S. economy, and we saw it with Lehman and Bear Stearns and all of that. So what's going on with Evergrande is really just a cash flow crunch. So the question is, how did Evergrande end up this way? And to understand that, we've got to look at their business model. Basically, Evergrande was founded in the mid-90s, and they dabbled in all sorts of areas, from bottled water to theme parks, I said that earlier, and even electric cars, which you've never heard of. And a soccer team? Yeah, they owned a soccer team. Anyways, they've got 200,000 employees. And honestly, this at the end of the day, it just looks like poor management to me. At least it looks like poor management on the surface. But there's layers of nuance here, so let's peel back the onion. Another reason that the executives in charge of Evergrande probably felt okay taking on huge amounts of debt is that homeownership is much, much more culturally and socially significant in China. So in the US, if you look, here's a graph. If you look over the last few decades, you can see that somewhere between 60 and 70% of households own their homes. And if we compare that with China, up to or nearly 90% of people in China own their homes. And that's just a simple, prioritization difference. They care a lot more about that. They're probably a little less likely to dabble in the stock market, and that's just how it is. So that's another layer of the onion. If we peel it back a little bit more, here's a third layer. And that's the policy decisions by Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party at large. So for many years, the CCP wanted to enable these levels of homeownership. They thought it was good. They wanted it to be affordable for Chinese citizens. Makes sense to me. But they kind of reversed course on that policy. So one of the ways they made it possible for all this homeownership to happen more easily is by allowing property developers to take on lots of debt, right? Okay, so then in August of 2020, just about a year ago, they abruptly changed course. And what they did is they implemented something called 3 red lines. And basically, these were 3 rules that limit how much Chinese companies, property developers, can borrow. Basically, they were cracking down on corporations that used a ton of debt to keep their crappy businesses going. And maybe it took them so long to do this, partially because real estate is just a huge driver of their economy. So in the US, real estate, I think, is about 5 to 6% of our GDP. And in China, that number is somewhere between 25 and 30%. So, they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot a little bit here, because by putting these 3 red lines in place, it's not just Evergrande that suffers. It's all of their property developers. But this action is being taken in the name of common prosperity. That's what Xi Jinping calls it. And it's his fight against inequality and really corporate greed. Now we have the situation where the rug has really been pulled out from under Evergrande. For many years, they were encouraged to borrow at high levels. And now the CCP turns around and says, just kidding. You have to keep the amount of debt you have below these levels. And so they've been scrambling for the last year or so to sell off assets, most of them at a loss, because when you have to sell something really quickly, you're going to sell below market value, and doing all kinds of accounting tricks and games and things to generate more cash so that they can pay down the debt that they have. So at the beginning, when I first saw the story, I thought, okay, poorly managed company. But when you peel back the layers of the onion a little bit more, it's not completely their fault. Yeah, they were irresponsible. They shouldn't have taken on that much debt. But also, you had a government encouraging you to do it. So I think equal parts blame, or 1/3 fault of CCP, 2/3 fault of Evergrande, something like that. Let's talk about Contagion now. So what I mean by that is the second and third order effects, what's going to happen if they become insolvent, how that ripple effect is going to hit both mainland China and the rest of the world. And I'll say right off the bat that, because China's not really known for their free speech, and they censor the press pretty heavily, the details of what the company's doing are not necessarily public information, but there are still some facts that get out. So one fact is, last Thursday, they had a couple of bond payments due, and they paid the local currency the one denominated in RMB, which is Chinese currency, and they did not pay the ones in foreign currency. Then yesterday, there was another bond payment that was due, and they missed that one too. So it seems like what's going to happen is they're going to prioritize paying the locally denominated, in Chinese currency bonds and maybe just let the other ones go. But the thing is that the company has a 30-day grace period on these bonds. So they're technically not in default until October 23rd on one of them and the 27th on another one. So that's when the real default will happen. And I'm going to keep tracking this story just to see how it unfolds. So since they've missed both of these bond payments on the 23rd and the 27th, the question now on everybody's mind is, what's the Chinese government going to do? Are they going to bail out the company or are they going to let it fail? What's interesting is this whole idea of too big to fail. It really didn't exist prior to the Great Recession in 2007, 2008. But I think governments have gotten wiser and they realize how one collapse can cause, these ripple effects. So, for example, when I look at the Great Recession, you can kind of see how Americans defaulting on their mortgages caused banks, which were essentially gambling on bad loans, to fail, and then foreclosure rates doubled, putting Americans on the street, and then that caused a distrust, amongst people and tightening of the money supply, and that decreased consumer spending, and that drove layoffs, and you can see the spiral happening. And I think that the Chinese Communist Party is very aware of this. So what's China to do? I think given this whole common prosperity agenda, there's a good chance they want to make an example out of Evergrande and this kind of Western capitalist greed model, and I think they're going to let it fail. But I don't think they're going to let this ripple effect happen in the economy. So my speculation is that they're going to protect their domestic banks that have exposure to Evergrande's bad debt. Because if Evergrande fails, and it really does seem like a when, not an if now, it could then cause the banks to fail, and then a run on the banks, and that could be, again, this kind of disastrous downward spiral. So very likely that domestic banks will be protected. So then the question is, what about international banks? And not so likely. I don't think anything's going to happen there. I think they're going to be left out to dry. I found this article here looking at what the exposure is for some of the other big banks. The list includes the like of the Ashmore Group, which I believe is out of London, BlackRock, which is obviously owns just about everything and anything in the US, UBS, which is Swiss, HSBC. You can see hundreds of millions in exposure here. And I think they're just going to have to eat it. But when you look at the size of those institutions, they'll be okay. I also think that the Communist Party is going to protect the consumer, the Chinese consumer. So currently there is 1.6 million homes and apartments that Chinese citizens have, put a down payment on, but have yet to been finished and delivered. So I think that the CCP is going to do a guarantee of activity, and they're going to ensure that the homes actually get completed and delivered. If they don't, that's a lot of people that are going to be disaffected by that problem. I will say it does seem like this might be tricky because these three red lines, these borrowing rules that I mentioned earlier, do apply to all property developers. So they might face an uphill battle if they take over Evergrande's projects because they also are highly indebted and subject to these debt limits. But at the end of the day, I do think that's what's going to happen. So that leaves other categories of people. That leaves any individual person that owns equity in the company, stock in the company, or bonds in the company. And I think that if you own an internationally denominated bond, one in US dollars, I think you're screwed. And if you own any stock in the company, also, you're probably screwed. Anyways, that's it for me. If you enjoyed this kind of content, please smash that subscribe button. I'm probably going to come out with an update in a couple of weeks because I'm curious to see if they do indeed default on these bonds. So anyways, thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.